Tonight we have a wonderful treat. We have Mr. Gray from the St. Lawrence Starch group of Grays talking to us about Port Credit and the Starch Company and the community effect that the company had on the people of Port Credit. So please welcome Mr. Gray.
I'd like to thank you for the introduction. It's a little grander, I think, than the topic of my speech. But anyway, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank the Mississauga Heritage Foundation for inviting me to talk to you this evening. To be frank, I must admit at the outset that it's been very difficult to determine just what it was I should talk to you about. Mississauga is a very big city, not just in terms of population, but in its geographic scope. Well, I'm sure there are some here tonight from Port Credit. I'm equally sure that there are many more from Clarkson, Cooksville, Streetsville, Dixie, Lakeview, all the old village centers that have now been enveloped, or some would no doubt say drowned, in the new megalopolis that now governs and determines the character and future of the old township of Toronto. And I'm not speaking as a dinosaur. Not really, I'm not. But as a resident of the old city of Toronto, now subjugated by the old suburbs, and Pache, now Glassman, and your North York cohorts, I suppose that I have somewhat jaundiced view of amalgamations, in as much as they homogenize, if there is such a word, all the old traditions and backgrounds of the established communities. I'm here to talk to you about the St. Lawrence Starch Company. And while I was introduced as being a St. Lawrence Starch Grey, I really don't have anything to do with it. But I do have my father here, who's had far too much to do with it, as you would say, and my brother Ian, who is continuing on with that tradition of having too much to do with the company. And it was founded in Port Credit 113 years ago by my great-grandfather, John Gray, whose birthday, incidentally, is today. He was born in Stratharble, in Perthshire, in Scotland, on April the 10th, 1842. So if he was here with us, and I'm sure he is in spirit, because he's probably looking down on me and criticizing everything I have to say, being a good Scot, he would be of a certain age. I suggested that my father would be the best to give you this address tonight. He, in no few words, made it quite clear that it was up to me. And because I have several other Grays here, I'm caught between a rock and a hard place. So I'm going to be in trouble for what I do say, and I will be in just as much trouble for what I don't. I was told that an illustrated talk would be best tonight. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I should put it in a positive sense, we have donated all of our corporate records, some 250 boxes of them, in cartons, as well as all the photographs and corporate publications that had to do with the St. Lawrence Starch Company and a number of our personal archives to the Archives of Ontario. And as a result of the current strike by our public servants, we haven't been able to access any of them to use in a slide presentation. However, there was a video record made of the company in the last month of its operations in 1990, in the spring of 1990, 100 years after the commencement of its operations in Port Credit. And I brought that, which we'll be looking at a little later. So my remarks are going to be relatively short. Perhaps not as short as you'd like, but they will be relatively short. And this video record incorporates a number of the visual images which are now in the Archives of Ontario. This is things that some of you whose memories may go back to the 1940s, including sound clips from West McKnight, his Beehive sports views, things to do with the Beehive hockey promotion, and things like that. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of the plant of the Gray family in Port Credit before we watch this video. For those of you who find the detail a little bit overwhelming, I apologize. For those of you who have an intimate knowledge of Old Port Credit and the starch works, I'm also going to apologize, because there's probably many of you, and I think I saw Lauren Joyce is down on the record. I can't see very well. Right, oh, they're right there, okay. He knows far more than I do about anything. And so it gets relatively difficult to talk on that sort of a basis, knowing that you have those sorts of people in your audience. When first asked if I'd give this address tonight, I turned to my copy of Betty Clarkson's Credit Valley Gateway. I was presented that by the Village of Port Credit in 1967 as a student at Forest Avenue Public School. Every child was. It was part of the Centennial Project of the Village of Port Credit. It's a great book. The research is excellent, and it's well written to boot. It also reflects, as one would expect, the particular interests of the author. But I was struck in rereading it in preparation for this talk tonight as to how very little was recounted about the St. Lawrence Starch Company. It merited about a paragraph in a history that amounts to about 215 pages. The St. Lawrence Starch Company, over its 100 years of active operations in the village of Port Credit, employed thousands of men, boys, and women. It was the major employer of labor. Its products put Port Credit on the map. It was a good, long-time citizen of the village, and many of the people who were employed there were the bulwarks of the local institutions. The origins of the Port Credit Library, St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, and the building of the Cenotaph, just to use a few examples, are rooted in families that lived here, that were employed by St. Lawrence Starch, including my own family, the Gray family. Every family that lived in Port Credit was special in its own right. Each had its own concerns, worries, its own triumphs and tragedies. I'm going to talk briefly about one family, my own, the Grays, in a sense which is a microcosm of what we all lived through. So it's going to sound like it's terribly oriented towards my own family, but at the same time, it's the same sort of experience that every family went through, whether they lived in Port Credit, Cooksville, Streetsville, wherever. So forgive me for talking as a Gray. I am one. Forgive me for talking as if Port Credit was the center of the universe. For my purposes, it was. Forgive me if I don't accord the interest that you would expect to some interest that you think special. Well, then you come here and make your own presentation. And just discover how difficult it is to give appropriate justice to all. In the fall of 1889, there was a group of 4 people, John Gray, Archibald Hutchison, and the 2 Kilgore brothers, who applied for a charter which went into the cell of the St. Lawrence Starch Company. They applied to the Dominion government for this charter. Now, why that name? Port Credit isn't exactly on the St. Lawrence. Most factories of the day were named for the locality where their works were located, for their principals, or used national titles, and often traded under a different name altogether. Several starch companies had used the word Dominion, the British American. There's a company down in Edwardsburg, which you'll hear about a little bit later, which is called Cardinal today, down the St. Lawrence, which used the name Canada. Toronto had been used, and Ontario. Now, Port Credit sounds a little bit too parochial to use as the name of a company, and the argument against the Gray Starch Company is self-evident. It seems reasonable to assume that the name St. Lawrence was taken for the simple reason that it is a name that was readily identifiable by every Canadian, wherever they lived, and at the same time not associated with any particular province, any particular locality, any particular municipality. If people confuse the company with another works located downstream on the St. Lawrence, that's to say, the company that was in business at the time, the Canada Starch Works, on the St. Lawrence, well, that wouldn't do any harm. Another consideration may have been that the fact that there was a sugar refinery trading under the name St. Lawrence Sugar, which you all know, that was already in business marketing cane syrups, which were a more expensive and comparable product to what St. Lawrence Starch intended to offer to the great Canadian public. An unexpected and potentially very serious issue arose at the end of March 1890. This is just when the company was in the process of becoming organized. One of the primary reasons that it was chosen as the location of the factory was the adjacent harbor. While the harbor was badly silted in at the time, the potential was there to bring in the corn by boat, corn being the raw product of the company, as well as rail, and as quite a large percentage of the outgoing freight was still carried by lake boats at that time, it might prove worthwhile in time shipping direct from Port Credit rather than shipping through Toronto. The Credit Harbour Company had been incorporated as a private company in 1834. It was one of the oldest incorporated bodies in Canada. Its charter being granted in the reign of William IV. Having just gone through the funeral of the Queen Mother, we all now have a very distinct idea of what the various reigns were and rules, I'm sure. William IV was Queen Victoria's uncle. Originally, 2/3 of the company had been held by the Mississauga and banded Indians that lived on the river a few miles upstream in what is now the Mississauga Golf Club. And under their direction, as majority shareholders, they constructed a port that could accommodate any ship that was then sailing on Lake Ontario at the mouth of the Credit. This was part of their leaders, Peter Jones's plan to make the band self-supporting. In time, the band moved away and their interest was bought out by a group styled the Peel Manufacturing Company that bought up a great deal of land in the 1870s along the river with the idea of exploiting the power potential of the Credit. Nothing of any account developed from their scheme, and the company lay dormant while the opportunity was seen to resurrect their power to levy tolls on any goods landed within 1 mile of the port. That was a power granted to the original applicants of the charter to protect their capital investment. So that's to say, if St. Lawrence was to build a wharf, and they are obviously within 1 mile of the port, for every bushel of corn that they could load, they had to pay 2 shillings to the Credit Harbour Company. As a result, they never built a wharf. No corn was ever brought in by water. When the Greys first moved to Port Credit, they rented a house at the corner of Cawthra Road and the Lakeshore Road. Port Credit was a very small town. It was a very small village. There weren't any homes to rent, so that's where they lived, and they walked in every day to the company when the factory where it was being built. A few months later, they rented the Alex Blakely house, which then stood where the St. Lawrence playing field was located up until a few years ago. It's now been totally torn up, and it's a parking area. Mr. Blakely had just finished the house, but he rented it to the Gray family before his own family had moved in, much to his wife's displeasure. The factory was being built in the spring of 1890, and towards the end of July, it must have presented quite a sight. It was still bright and clean, but now soaking wet, with a regular river of water flowing through it. Everything was built out of wood. It's amazing to think today, when you go into a factory, you think in terms of electronics, you think in terms of plastics and metals. At that time, pretty well everything was made out of wood. All the tubs and tanks were made out of wood. They were all brand new, and they all had to be filled with water to take up before being put in use. The new work leaked like the devil to begin with, so the plant was awash from the top down until all the staves had a chance to swell. The boilers had been fired just before this to test not only them, but the engines as well. There was naturally no electricity or town water, so the boilers had to be filled with buckets before the fire was laid. Once pressure showed in the glass, attention would have shifted to the pump that drew water from the well in the boiler room. Obviously, if you have boilers, you have to have water and access to water. There was just a well in the boiler room with a line that went out 50 feet into the lake, which was used by gravity to fill this well, and they would pump the water from that to use as a feed source for the steam engines, or for the boiler, which would drive the steam engines. Once the pump started to turn, the feed pumps for the boilers were opened up, and later that day the big driving engine was turned over, attended by a Goldie McCulloch mechanic. It was a single-cylinder 11 by 28 engine with a pulley flywheel, 8.5-foot base. I think that's something that we don't understand today. Again, we talk about electronics, we talk about mechanics. In the old days, everything was driven by steam. We're talking about the St. Lawrence Starch Company, but it was the same story in any company that you went to, in any small town, any large city. in Ontario, in Canada, throughout the civilized world. You had boilers, you had a large steam engine. From that, all power was derived. That power was transmitted throughout the plant. You didn't have individual engines or motors driving any particular piece of machinery within the plant. It was all driven from a centrally located engine. In August of 1890, when the plant was actually put into operation, they filled the steeps. There was a certain balls up, if I can use the expression. They tried to open the valve at the bottom of the steep and it wouldn't open. So they were quite keen on getting the people from the John Inglis Company to come out and open it. But they started producing starch in the fall of 1890, and a number of the lines that were being produced right through to the end of the company's operations in Port Credit, such as Ivory Gloss and Durham, were being produced right from the very beginning. Now, in the 1890s, life hadn't changed particularly in Port Credit. The rural rhythms were about the same. At the same time, the day was divided up and given shape by steam whistles. A couple of dozen times a day, trains would roar through, sounding at all the level crossings. In the quiet of the countryside in those days, you could hear a train working its way. Sometimes it seemed all the way from Oakville to Mimico. During the summer, the Garden City or one of the other lake boats would call at the wharf with their own distinctive calls. And then there was, of course, the factory whistle in Port Credit from St. Lawrence Starch, calling it morning, noon, and night. Right up until 1945, the standard shift of the company was from 6 to 7 during the day and from 7 to 6 during the night. There was just 2 shifts. That's in the process. The people who were actually manufacturing the goods. If you worked at night, you worked at night continuously. If you worked during the day, you were a day man. There was no change in shift. And that didn't change, as I say, until 1946. The people who were working at the day jobs, such as packaging or working within the company, sorry, I thought it was something trying to go. That was straight 7 o'clock till 5 o'clock during the day. At the office hours were from 8 till 6, with an early closing at 2 in the afternoon on Saturdays. There were a number of summer homes and cottages that were built along the lake in the early 1900s. There had been a number of places built in Lorne Park in the 1880s and 90s, and that added a great deal to the social life of the area in and around Port Credit in the early part of the century. My grandfather belonged to a group called the Lorne Park Bachelors Association, which was the focus of a great deal of activity with hay rides, any nine. That's where he met my dad's mother. They had regular dances in the city. They had any number of dances in and around Lorne Park. There was regattas held in Lorne Park. And I guess, just as an aside, while we're talking about that, the river, of course, was used for transportation, it was used for fishing, it was used by the stonehunters. But people who lived in and around the village also used the river to a much greater extent than we do today. It wasn't just used by rowing clubs or canoe clubs. Any number of people had canoes, rowboats, used them regularly. My father was just mentioning the other day about Mr. J.J. Foy. They lived on the Mississauga Road, and he worked in the city. And he would commute by train into the city. And when he came home, he would walk down to the riverbank, and his wife would have rowed across the river to meet him every night to row her back to their home. The harbour in Port Credit, of course, in the early 1900s was still a working one, though. There was the stone hookers and the fishing boats. And there was more and more pleasure boats coming from Toronto to use it as an anchor. The pillars of the village life remained the churches and fraternal organizations, the Orange Lodge and the Masons. The Anglican Church and Stave Bank next to the Orange Lodge was well established, and the Methodist Church on the other side of the river, just up from the Masonic Temple, was almost 75 years old. A village school had been built in the early 1890s, Riverside, which put an end to the long walk to the Old Stone Township School that was a couple of miles down the Lakeshore Road towards Long Branch. I think my grandfather was one of the last classes that graduated from that stone school. And typically, you either left when you were 14 or went on to continuation school until you were 16 before you went on to university. Up until the early 1900s, if you wanted to continue your education, if you lived in Port Credit, you had to take the train to Oakville. In the early 1900s, once they built the Collegiate Institute in Parkdale, you took the train to Parkdale. It wasn't until Forest Avenue School was built that a continuation school was built in Port Credit so that you could attend school in Port Credit. And even into the 1930s, when the Port Credit High School was built, that was drawing people from all over the southern part of the township. Canada, as part of the British Empire, went to war on Tuesday, August the 4th, 1914. The Great War was to be waged for over 4 years until the 11th of November of 1918. And we're not going to go into the history of that war, obviously. But the changes in society and attitudes, business and government, and the Canadian polity have been well documented and cannot be overstated. The givens of life were all up to question, but certainly suddenly became uncertain. The local county regiment, the Peel Regiment, which used to be known as the 35th Regiment, had a company based in Port Credit, and Fred Hamilton, Hamilton's General Store, had been its captain. Any number of people from the village joined up, including Adam Weir, who was one of the indispensables of the company. He was the chief salesman. He was the colonel of the Bruce Battalion, went overseas with the 160th Battalion. Loretta Brown, who's known as Brownie, she was in charge of the office, and she started as a stenographer in 1911, but then she became a nursing sister. And any number of people joined up. So finding local labor became a major problem. As people joined up, they generally went down to Niagara, where they were formed into battalions. Then they marched through Port Credit on their way to Toronto before they were shipped overseas. When they came through Port Credit, they would camp in the Grove. That's the area north of the Lakeshore Road, near Forest Avenue. As the St. Lawrence Starch Company at that time was building a new factory, the tubs and tanks that were being built were used as an area for or used as a facility for the people to bathe in. The local women, members of the Imperial, what's it called? The IOD. You all know. Just the IOD, that's what they've always been. They had facilities set up in what became the St. Lawrence Ball Field later on, where they would sell refreshments to the men. The company was used again after the war because they established the people who were involved with the company were responsible for setting up the reception committee for the men when they marched back. There was a parade which went down the Lakeshore Road. There's aerial views of that, which are down at the Provincial Archives. Again, I'd like to have brought them tonight, but I couldn't because they're in the archives. But there was a reception down at the Ben McCrae Park, and later on, and 3 years later, there was the cenotaph built at opposite St. Andrew's Church. I'm just looking at the time, I'm sorry, but we've got a video, and it might be appropriate if we looked at the video now, if there's any questions.
Are you sure?
Pardon me?
Are you sure that's under it?
Well, let's look at the video, and I'll continue afterwards. I was just worried about time. This video may well provide far more detail than we want. Okay. Nisha?
I bring laundry starch. Durham cornstarch. St. Lawrence
Can you increase the
corn.
volume a little bit?
Beehive corn syrup. How easily we take for granted these familiar items many of us grew up with.
The makers of Beehive Syrup present hockey interviews with Wes McKnight. Howdy do sports fans. The makers of that grand energy food, Beehive Syrup, bring you the 10th in our new series of hockey interviews with stars of the National Hockey League. Here's Jack Dennis with a flavor story on our great energy food. Thanks, Wes. You'll really like the delicious taste of Beehive Golden Syrup. It has a flavor that not only appeals to children, and third, a top-quality culinary starch known by the familiar blue and yellow label and liked by good cooks for its dependability. Durham Cornstarch. D-U-R-H-A-M. Durham Cornstarch. And now here's Wes McKnight again. On behalf of the St. Lawrence Starch Company and myself, I wish to extend to our many friends and listeners our very best wishes for the new year 1944.
Behind these familiar names is a century-long story of a small Canadian manufacturer developing and surviving in a competitive world. It's a little-known aspect of our own history, and it's the story of what most would consider a rather unremarkable commodity, cornstarch. In 1989, St. Lawrence Cornstarch celebrated its 100th anniversary as a family-owned Canadian producer of cornstarch. The town of Port Credit, Ontario, has grown up with this plant as a familiar landmark. But an era is passing. In 1990, the plant is about to undergo more than just another of the many changes it's seen over the years. Behind these walls, a small part of our history is about to disappear.
John Gray was born in Scotland in 1842, and he was born on a small farm. After his father died, he went into industry. And he got into various fields, and it was in 1865 that he started in a starch factory in Glasgow at James Anderson's Works. There was quite a widespread industry in that area in Scotland, especially in neighbouring Paisley, to feed starch to the mills of the Scottish lowlands and the Midlands and across the Channel in Ulster. And he worked there for about 8 years until he was hired by William Thomas Benson to come to Canada to manage the Canada Starch Works in Edwardsburg, Ontario.
Well, he was a typical farmer. He married Agnes Malcolm in Scotland and had 3 children when he came out to Canada. They then continued until they had 9. And the 9th daughter, this would be
They weren't Catholics.
the daughter, Agnes died. So John wrote home to her sister, Jessie, who was 17, and said, "You better come out here and look after your sister's children." So she came, and I don't know, somewhere along the line they got married and produced another. So that made 10. So to start off a venture like this with 9 children and put everything you had into it, I think it took quite a bit of Spanish courage.
John Gray, I guess, made a name for himself as being the preeminent starchman, but the only one in Canada who could make a satisfactory glucose by the time he started this company in 1889.
Starch is a natural and surprisingly versatile product that's been used throughout history. Every form of plant life produces starch in its leaves by photosynthesis. They transform the starch into glucose, a form of sugar, as food energy for the rest of the plant. Humans have used the starch from wheat, potatoes, and rice since ancient times. as a stiffener or linen, a thickener in cooking, an adhesive paste, and in the 1700s, Europeans used it in enormous amounts just as a powder for their hair. In the Americas, from the southern empires of the Aztecs to the northern tribes in Canada, corn was the staple crop. Early settlers found it easier to grow than their familiar wheat. Today, corn is still a major crop in the Western Hemisphere. It produces more carbohydrate or starch per acre than any other source. But getting the starch out of the corn was much more difficult than getting it out of other plants. The corn kernel is a seed. The part that will grow into the corn plant, the germ, sits in the center with a little drop of oil inside. The rest of the kernel is the rich starter food for the germ to use while it grows its roots and leaves. This food is made up of starch, which is a carbohydrate, and gluten, which is a protein. On the outside is a tough protective layer of fiber, the hull. The hardest part in extracting the starch from the rest of the kernel is separating it from the gluten. Nature has bound them together very strongly. Most grains are milled or ground up into a flour when they're hard and dry. Corn is one of the few milled wet. These huge tanks at St. Lawrence are used for soaking or steeping the corn. They're 5 stories high, built of reinforced concrete, lined with stainless steel, and can hold up to 4,000 bushels. The corn is steeped in a mixture of water and sulfur dioxide. This softens the kernels, dissolves away any soluble material, and most importantly, helps to break down the stubborn bonding between the gluten and the starch.
Some of these tanks were built in 1912. They've obviously been changed quite a bit since then. They've been enlarged, and a number of new ones have been added. At that time, they were only processing about 1,500 bushels of corn a day, and they're doing something in the neighborhood of just under 20,000 bushels a day today. The steeps originally would have been made out of boilerplate. That's because there was a different process used. They used a caustic process. They used alkali rather than an acid process. Acid eats steel, and so when they changed over to the acid process in 1902, they had to eliminate the old boilerplate steep tanks and replace them with wooden ones. The big thing with the wooden process tanks and the wooden steeps was the fact that they would rot out. So you had, well, some of the most important men you'd find in the plant weren't the mechanics that you'd find today in the pipe fitters, but they'd be coopers and people who could work with wood, the carpenters. Things were rotting out continuously because so much water was used in the process. The old rule of thumb was 150 gallons of fresh water would be used to each bushel of corn that was processed. Originally, the system would be described as an open system. By that, I mean that water would be introduced at any point. Whenever they were finished with the water, it would just be drained off into the gutter and on out into the lake. By the mid-1920s, it became a lot more important to get the highest yield they could. By yield, I mean they wanted to get the most oil, the most feed, the most starch, be it in the form of a dry starch or a glucose, that they could. There was an awful lot of good, protein that was used, or at least not that was used, that was dissolved in the waters of the process. So rather than having that go into the gutter, it suddenly became important to use those processed waters over and over again, and at the end of the day, to boil it down and add it to the feed to raise the protein content of the feed. Later, nothing was wasted. Every part of the kernel was used.
The steeped kernels lead through the bottom of the tanks, starting on a journey that will see all of its parts separated and turned into hundreds of different products. Before reaching its first destination, the corn has to be cleaned of any matter that might damage the teeth on the mill plates. The corn can then pass in stages through a series of 2 attrition mills and 2 grinding mills. These crush and break up the kernels, loosening the hulls and freeing the germ. The corn is now a wet slurry, and between each trip to the grinding mills, it's screened and washed in its own liquid and mixed back in again and again to remove as much of the starch and gluten as possible from the crushed kernels.
The original method of grinding was similar to what you'd see if you went to a grist mill in a pioneer village. It was basically just two big birthstones that were revolving at a high speed. The corn was introduced in the center of the stone, and water was added to it. The stones were driven by belts, which were running from overhead line shafting. In those days, there was only one central source of power. It was usually a great steam engine with anywhere from a 14 to a 16-foot flywheel to be turning over at about 90 revolutions per minute. It would have been a really exciting thing to see, because this wheel would have been very well balanced. There would have been a belt going off to a line shaft. That line shaft would be the main source of power for the whole plant. All these belts would be slapping and banging as they go through floors, they go around equipment. Some of them would be anywhere up to 18 inches wide and 20 feet long. Some of the pulleys would be just a foot wide, depending on how fast they wanted the piece of equipment to turn. It might be 5 feet wide. In the early part of this century, they started to separate the germ from the fiber. That was when they wanted to recover the oil. That was done basically by taking the coarse meal that was left after it had been ground and washed. The starch had been washed out, and it was floated through what was called a germ separator, which was basically working on the principle that the germ was lighter with oil content, it would float to the surface of the tub, and it was raked off. It would then be washed again and further processed into oil. That was the process that was used up until the early 1960s, when they changed over to the current practice of using germ foam.
The lighter germ is separated from the heavier fiber by small cyclones created in the germ separator. Tony, the wet mill manager, explains.
This is a germ foam separator. The first stage in the process where you're actually separating different parts of the kernel form. The product is being pumped under pressure into a central header which feeds all the cones at the same time. Very simple process. The product is being pumped into the cone from this direction. Comes in and it'll start to circulate, spinning around inside here. Pressure forces the lighter material or germ in the corn to come out through the top of the cone. The heavier material is the untracked little corn or the skin of the kernel. Gets forced down through a large section of the cone. You can see that it's all very simple. There's nothing inside, nothing complicated going on. It's just everything is spinning around. And the pressure is forcing the different materials to go in different directions inside the cone.
With the cyclone sending the germ out the top and the heavier corn fiber out the bottom, we now have two streams to follow. Both are still slurries. The liquid they're carried in contains the all-important starch gluten mix. Another series of washes and screening, separations and centrifuging make sure every last particle of starch is captured. Then the starchy liquids themselves are recovered. The moisture in the germ is squeezed out in an expeller, known on the plant floor as the germ squeezer. The germ heads for the oil department. The fiber goes to a flotation tank called the muddler. Here it's held in suspension before being spun dry in large centrifuges, ground again to a fine mash, and sent to the feed department. The creamy liquid left over, now called the mill stream, heads off to the starch department. This is where that stubborn gluten is finally separated from the starch. The separation process occurs as a continuous 9-stage refinement of both the starch and the gluten. It's achieved primarily by passing the mill stream through this bank of hydroclones. Inside each one, there are many little cyclones that work in exactly the same way as the germ clones we saw before. The stream is pumped in under high pressure, forcing the heavier starch out one side and the lighter gluten out the other.
In the old days, there was a tremendous amount of floor space occupied by tables. The tables were really just inclined trays, about 110 to 112 feet long. They were 2.5 to 3 feet wide, and they'd be in banks anywhere up to 40 to 60 feet wide. The whole principle behind them was the separation of the gluten from the starch. The effectiveness and the success in that separation of the gluten, which is a protein, from the starch, which is what you want, was the determinant factor in how successful you were as a starchman. So the actual tabling, as it was called, of the starch was probably one of the most important aspects of the whole operation. Today that's been replaced by using centrifuges. Their theory is much like that of a cream separator. You're using the different densities of the different constituent parts to spin off and separate the various elements of the milk stream.
This is pure starch milk. A specific gravity meter is used to check the foaming or the density of the solids. These solids are the starch that have to be maintained at a foaming of 21. The starch milk is run through a loop to be drawn out by different departments for conversion. From this basic milk, many different kinds of starches can be produced. Any of several chemicals can be added to modify the nature of the finished starch. These specialty starches are controlled to produce more than 40 different end products.
Most people couldn't imagine the number of uses that starch have today. You'll find in everything from textiles, from the clothing you're wearing, to any food stuff that you'll find in the stores, to building materials, explosives, paper manufacturing, even to the fillers in aspirin tablets that you'll buy. It's used primarily today in the pulp and paper industry. That's in paper making, in the making of corrugated board. It's used to a very large extent in just about every aspect of the food industry. Special starches have been designed for the preparation of the pre-prepared foods that you'll find in the shops today.
On a broader scale, there has always been a surplus of corn in North America. So there's always been the ambition to create a value-added product from a natural indigenous crop, corn in the United States. So universities, many research type of institutions have always been looking for new uses. And I think that in Canada, our competition in Canada are American-owned, and therefore that technology and product lines and so on really stem from the U.S. In St. Lawrence's case, clearly we had to maintain a product line competitive with these new applications in order to maintain our independent identity.
But no matter what final product the starch is destined to become, the water still has to be removed from it. This is done in large vacuum drum filters. As the drum revolves, the vacuum sucks the liquid in through the filter, blocking the current, and leaving the cake on the surface. At up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, the milk smells strongly of sulfur dioxide. Springs around the drum lift the cake starch and deposit it on the conveyor screen heading into the dryers. Inside, temperatures are over 240 degrees Fahrenheit as huge fans draw heated air through the screens, extracting the moisture. The cake is dry and powdery in 20 minutes, ready to be packaged. The starch is finally on its way, some to become coatings for paper, others to create edibility textures in commercial soups and pie fillings, and some to become the original and familiar Durham cornstarch.
John Gray would be pleased if he came back and saw the operation today, how much more quickly and easily starch could be dried than it was when he was actively involved in the operations. In the old days, it was very time-consuming. It was very labor-intensive. And it, again, occupied a great deal of space. The basic theory was very simple. It was kiln drying. It was the same idea that they'd introduced back in the 18th century when they first started putting lumps of starch wrapped in paper in a baker's oven, which the starchman would rent for the purpose. The kilns were long tunnels. They were made of terracotta brick, and there was a railway track, very small light railway track, running down through them. There was a door at each end, and trains of cars bearing trays of starch would be made up. As the starch came off the breaker, it was put onto a tray, which was loaded into the cart and introduced at one end of the tunnel kiln. But dry starches themselves weren't the only end product. From the wet starch and liquid starch, they made glucose as well. What John Gray introduced when he undertook the manufacture of glucose at Edwardsburg was the conversion in a closed vessel. And what that means is that rather than taking several hours to bring about this conversion under heat and acid, you add pressure, and the conversion can be made in about 20 minutes. That's what made it economically viable. And it could also, because the parameters weren't quite as loose, you could control the conversion to a much greater extent than you could under the old open system.
In 1990, half of all the starch produced at St. Lawrence is converted to glucose here in the glucose refinery. This is the converter. Its basic purpose is to hydrolyze the starch with muriatic acid under intense steam heat and pressure. The process is finely tuned and capable of precisely converting the starch into a wide variety of glucose syrups for many different end uses. To dissipate the intense heat and steam generated by the converter, the glucose is blown through these huge cyclones before the acids are neutralized and cooled for filtering. Almost magically, if it weren't so scientific, that bland white starch has been converted to a thin and watery but distinctly sweet glucose syrup. The first filter, this powerful centrifuge, removes the fatty acids that won't convert in the process. These are sent to the feed mix. In a second filtering, the thin syrup is pumped through the fine mesh screen inside large pressure vessels. Another filter for this stage is a large vacuum drum, similar to that in the starch process, except that here it's the sweet product that's left in the tank and the impurities that are removed. Activated charcoal forms the third and final filtering for most syrups, as they're forced under pressure upwards through the mass of fine particles in this enormous column of carbon. This removes any elements that would color the final product. Now cleaned and decolorized, the water content of the thin syrup is reduced in these evaporators. The liquid glucose is concentrated by boiling under a vacuum until the solids content reaches about 80%. Now it's ready for packaging. For commercial use, it's poured through cone-shaped filter screens. Some is still packed in 55-gallon drums, but most of it is shipped out by bulk transport. Destined for bakeries and breweries as a commercial sweetener, it's hauled in tanker trucks as well as by rail. And of course, for us consumers, it's bottled as the well-known Beehive Golden Corn Syrup. Who would have guessed that such an apparently straightforward product, made out of a kernel of corn, actually goes through this many processes before it reaches our table?
Well, that's the end of the story of the starch-related products, but there's one other brand that was introduced some time ago which most people are familiar with, corn oil. The oil comes from the germ in the kernel of the corn. It was first recovered in 1904, and they started refining in 1930 using the same process that they're basically using today.
If you'll remember, the germ was separated out back at the germ clone stage. Then it was washed and screened and finally squeezed out in the germ squeezer. After that, it went off to be dried. These rotary drum dryers are similar to those installed almost 80 years ago. They work alongside newer equipment and can dry a batch of corn germ and get it back up to the oil department in little more than 15 minutes. In the oil department, a rotary screen sifts the dried germ before it enters the oil expellers. Inside these expellers are two sets of cylinders, or barrels made of long bars. Augers in the cylinders turn and force the germ up against the side bars at a pressure of many tons. The oil escapes through the space between the bars. All that's left coming off the augers in the last cylinder is the crushed germ. It's packed densely into what's called the oil cake. This too is added to the feed mix. The oil coming out is in a crude state, so moves on for more processing. In the oil refinery, an alkaline solution or caustic soda is added to the crude oil in what's called the reaction tank. Within an hour, this brings about a separation called a break. The lighter oil becomes clear and stays on top. The heavier fatty acids called the soap stock form flakes and settle to the bottom. These flakes, or soap stock, are drawn off and actually are used in the manufacture of some brands of soap. The oil itself is cleaned again in a multi-layered paper filter press. It's forced through the filter under a gentle pressure so as not to damage the fragile, untreated paper fibers. Even after all this, the oil still contains impurities, some that affect both its taste and smell. To get rid of these, steam is forced right through the oil for about 9 hours in tanks called deodorizers. A vacuum sucks the vapor off the top, carrying the impurity with it. Finally, the oil is refrigerated to solidify any remaining waxes that might form a haze in the finished product. These impurities are removed in one glass refrigerated filter, and St. Lawrence corn oil is ready for the dinner table.
Virtually every component of a kernel of corn has a known and valuable use. The fiber and protein for animal feed, corn oil for cooking oil, and of course the starch. And those are essentially the four components of corn. So it lends itself easily to, and very well, to really getting striving to achieve every possible value you can from a kernel.
The feed is a good example. When the company first started, anything other than starch was considered a byproduct and they just wanted to dispose of it. They started selling feed in the early 1890s and they started quantifying and selling it. Later on, things like steep water, which had also just been discarded and sent into the sewers, was dried, added to the feed, which increased the value of the feed because it raised the protein content of it. When they started recovering germs, something else again had just been discarded. They got oil from it, a new product to manufacture and sell. What was left over from that manufacturing process was once again added to the feed, again improving the quality and the profile of the feed.
Pipes from all over the main plant converge here at the feed hole. They carry the liquids extracted in the processing, as well as the more solid feed mash, all on its way to the feed house. Through the overhead walkways connecting the buildings, more pipes carry the ingredients for the feed over from the main plant. At the feed house end of the walkway, a series of large centrifuges. These are called the charcoals after their manufacturer, and they're the first step of a major dewatering process. Here, all the liquids are removed from the feed and then sent down to holding tanks. The liquids from the charcoals are mixed in with the steep liquor. Large volumes of these liquids are being produced all the time. They have to be reduced and their nutrients recovered. It takes this enormous set of vacuum evaporators to concentrate the liquids down into a form of heavy steep water, which can be added back into the feed. Coming from the sharples, the dewatered feed itself is flash dried in this incinerator-heated intensive dryer. It's drawn upwards through the tall column by a 250 horsepower fan into 4 huge cyclones to reduce the moisture content even further. The dried feed and the heavily concentrated steep water are then mixed back together in this large better tumble dryer. The exhaust from the tumble dryer is recycled into the incinerator at 1600 degrees Fahrenheit to burn off any remaining vapors and pollutants. All that's left over from the whole process, apart from the feed, of course, is the pure water vapor leaving the cyclone stack. After one last dry milling, the feed is ready. While a small portion is still bagged, most of it is shipped up in trucks and hopper cars.
We tried to keep things separated. We tried to innovate. We could see that we were small and we wanted to get into a niche that we could fill without competing with the very large other millers. See, we were grinding at the moment about 20,000 bushels a day capacity, which is about the output of about 200 acres. Now that sounds quite a lot, but still, Archer Daniels Midland in the U.S. are grinding 800,000 bushels every day. There's a whole trainload of up to 70 rail cars that leave their plant every day. So we were small, so we were trying to stay in a position that we would be able to compete in some facet. I suppose the final straw, or the straw that broke the camel's back, was the implementation of the countervailing duty in Canada. The countervailing duty put an enormous disadvantage specifically on domestic or Canadian manufacturers whose principal market was Canada, and that's us. So it really, we got to the point then that the company could not afford to reinvest in the equipment. We have responsibilities to our employees that rely on the Starch Company to supply a good living and a safe workplace. And in the end, we had to take a long look in the mirror and really decide, are we being a responsible employer, dealing with issues that are way beyond our control. So the countervailing issue was the last straw. The future will be to continue opportunities and seek out opportunities for starch-related or grain-related technology and products. We will continue our initiative with EcoStar, starch and plastics technology. I think that we will take advantage and maintain our reputation, I hope goodwill in the Canadian marketplace through an exciting alliance with the Staley manufacturing in the United States. It's the second largest corn miller in the world, and we will be able to now offer our customers world-class technology, a world-class product line, and particularly these new applications that have been part of the corn milling industry since its inception.
But this will be a big change for the plant. Much of it will be dismantled. This steam-driven turbine has been providing power to the factory since 1928. Once among the largest of only a few self-contained electrical generating systems in North America, it too will soon pass into memory. The call of whistle has signaled leaving time for the men and women at the St. Lawrence Starch Works for over 100 years. On the 30th of March 1990, this familiar sound takes on a different significance.
Everybody, I think, has that feeling that we're all part of a group. Therefore, this experience that we're going to be facing in the months away, a dramatic experience for many, and myself included. Because I feel a lot of these people, most of these people are my friends. It's going to be a sad day